before tonight's journey begins. Let me know where you're listening from. Now, settle in. Let your shoulders soften. Let your breathing slow, and allow the day to drift quietly away. Tonight we travel to the Cotswolds in April of 1909, to the great conservatory at Marloe Hall, where ferns hang like green lace. Among them is Thomas Hargreaves, a 52-year-old glasshouse keeper, carrying a lantern, a leather logbook, and a grief that has not thawed since his wife Eleanor died. He expects only a solitary night of stoking boilers and checking vents. But the old herbalist, Mrs. Pargeter, who has known these plants for half a century, will show him something else entirely. This is the story of Thomas, and of one spring night when a man who had forgotten how to be still discovers that some things grow best in the dark. So close your eyes, breathe gently, and let the warmth of the glasshouse carry you through velvet shadows and sleep. The last of the sun was a smear of copper behind the ridge of the great glass roof, and Thomas Hargreaves stood perfectly still among the tree ferns, a lantern hanging from his left hand, its wick turned so low that the flame was no more than a blue bead trembling in its glass chimney. He had been in the conservatory since 5:30, and in the hour that followed he had done almost nothing except move from the north door to the central octagon and back again, as if the act of walking might press his thoughts into a shape he could understand. The air around him was thick, warm, and sweet, with the smell of damp loam and the faint, peppery tang of pelargonium leaves that had been bruised somewhere in the day's tidying. He could hear the soft creak of the iron roof ties, cooling after the afternoon sun, a sound so familiar that he had stopped noticing it years ago, and yet tonight it seemed to him like the long, slow exhale of a creature that lived inside the glass itself. He set the lantern down on a teak staging and opened the logbook that he kept in the deep pocket of his waistcoat, a book bound in green leather with pages that had turned the color of weak tea from a decade of entry after entry. He wrote the date, April 14th, 1909, and beneath it, in the small, exact handwriting that had once made Eleanor say he wrote like a man afraid of wasting ink, he noted the temperature in the palm house, the humidity reading from the hygrometer that hung beside the boiler room door, and the fact that the night vent on the eastern ridge had been left a quarter open by one of the under-gardeners. There was a faint smudge of soil on the page from the morning, and he looked at it for a long moment without wiping it away. It was good soil, a mix of 3 parts, Kentish loam, 1 part leaf mold, and a handful of crushed charcoal that he had made himself in the brick kiln behind the bothy. He knew its texture by touch, and he knew that Eleanor would have teased him for caring more about a smudge of soil than about the smudge of coal dust on his collar. But Eleanor was not there to tease him, and had not been for 3 years. Beyond the octagon, the conservatory fell away into a sequence of glazed walks and chambers, each with its own climate, its own smell, its own quality of light. The whole structure was a quarter of a mile long if you measured it from the boiler house at the west end to the cool fernery at the east, and it contained more than 8,000 panes of glass, each one cut to fit its own cast-iron frame, each one cleaned twice a year by men on tall ladders who worked in silence, because the head gardener, Mr. Finch, believed that talking wasted breath that could be used for work. Thomas had been head glasshouse keeper for 12 years now, and he knew every pane, every pipe, every valve and stopcock in the heating system. He knew that the 3rd hot water pipe in the orchid house had a habit of knocking when the pressure rose above 12 pounds, and that the white jasmine on the south wall would release its scent only after 9 o'clock in the evening, as if it were waiting for the house to go to bed. He knew these things the way a sailor knows the moods of a particular stretch of coast, and they had become, over the years, the architecture of his days, a structure that held him upright when everything else had fallen away. He closed the logbook and tucked it back into his waistcoat, then lifted the lantern again and began his slow circuit of the central octagon. The floor was laid with black and white tiles in a pattern of interlocking diamonds, and his footsteps made a sound that was halfway between a tap and a whisper. The leather of his boots worn soft from 1,000 rounds just like this one. Above him the roof rose to a peak of 60 feet, a vast canopy of glass and iron that on a clear night showed the stars moving in their slow arc. But tonight the glass was dark as slate, and the only stars were the reflections of his lantern flame, trembling in the panes. He thought, as he often did, that a glass house at night was a different country from the one that existed in the day. By daylight it was a place of work, of watering and pruning, and the constant, gentle war against greenfly and mildew. But at night it became something else, something quieter and more private, a place where the plants seemed to breathe more deeply, and the shadows pooled like water in the corners. It was, he had come to believe, the only place where his mind could slow enough to let him remember Eleanor, without the sharp edge of grief that accompanied memory in every other room of the cottage they had shared. He passed the great Australian tree fern that stood in the center of the octagon, its fronds spreading 15 feet in every direction, and he paused to touch one of the new fiddleheads that was still curled tight as a bishop's crozier. The frond was cool and firm, covered in a soft brown fur that felt like the nap of a velvet cushion, and he let his fingers rest there for a moment, feeling the life that was packed into that tight spiral, the whole future of the frond, folded into a space no bigger than his thumb. It was a thing he had done 1,000 times, but tonight it felt different, and he could not have said why. Perhaps it was the stillness of the air, which was so complete that he could hear the faint tick of the barometer in the palm house 50 yards away. Perhaps it was the knowledge that he would be alone in the glass house until dawn, that no undergardener would arrive with questions, no housemaid would hurry through with a pair of scissors to cut flowers for the breakfast table. He was alone with the ferns and the palms and the orchids, and the weight of that solitude was not a burden, but a kind of permission. He could stand here for an hour if he wished, and no one would know, and no one would care, and the glass house would keep its own counsel. He moved on, through the arch that led into the palm house, and the air changed at once, growing warmer and wetter, the smell shifting from the green, living scent of ferns to the darker, earthier odor of tropical bark and standing water. The palms rose around him like the pillars of a submerged cathedral, their trunks wrapped in the fibrous net of their own old fronds, their crowns lost in the shadows above the reach of his lantern. Water dripped somewhere with a regular, unhurried sound, a single drop falling from a leaf tip into a stone basin every 5 seconds, and Thomas found himself counting them without meaning to. 1, 2, 3, 4, drip. 1, 2, 3, 4, drip. A rhythm that was older than the glass house, and older than the hall, and older, perhaps, than any human worry. He stopped counting. He stood very still, breathing in the thick, tropical air, and for a moment the grief inside him felt less like a wound and more like a stone that had been worn smooth by a river, still heavy, but no longer sharp, and he did not know whether to be grateful for that or afraid of it, because grief was all he had left of her, and to let it go seemed like a second loss. He shook his head, a tiny movement, and continued his round. Thomas Hargreaves lived in a cottage that stood at the edge of the kitchen garden, just far enough from the hall to be invisible from its windows, but near enough that he could reach the boiler house in under 4 minutes if the wind changed and the temperature inside the glass house began to drop. The cottage had 2 rooms downstairs and 2 above, and it was built of the same honey-colored Cotswold stone as the hall itself, with a steep roof of stone tiles that were covered in a crust of gray-green lichen. A wisteria grew up the front wall and over the porch, its branches as thick as a man's wrist, and in April, the first of its purple flowers were beginning to open, hanging in clusters that trembled in the slightest breeze, and filled the doorway with a scent like cool honey. Inside, The cottage was neat to the point of severity, not because Thomas was a tidy man by nature, but because he had found, in the months after Eleanor's death, that the only way to keep his mind from unraveling was to impose an order on the things he could control. His boots stood side by side on a square of oilcloth by the back door. His cups hung from hooks beneath the dresser, each one facing the same way. The clock on the mantelpiece was wound every Sunday evening at 6 o'clock precisely, and it kept time so faithfully that he could set the boiler timers by it. He had risen that morning, as he rose every morning, at 4:45, when the sky beyond the bedroom window was still the color of a mussel shell, and the first blackbird had only just begun its tentative pre-dawn song. He washed in cold water from the ewer on the washstand, the cold shocking his skin into alertness, and he dressed in the same clothes he had worn every working day for the past 11 years, a pair of heavy twill trousers, a collarless shirt of gray flannel, a waistcoat with 4 pockets, and a coat of brown worsted that had been patched at the left elbow with a piece of fabric that did not quite match. The coat had been a gift from Eleanor, bought from a tailor in Cirencester on his 40th birthday, and he could not bring himself to replace it even though the cuffs were fraying and the lining had worn thin at the shoulders. He buttoned the waistcoat, tucked the leather logbook into its pocket, and went downstairs to make tea. The kitchen was small and square, with a range that had been black-leaded until it shone like a mirror, and a window that looked out over a patch of earth where Eleanor had once grown lavender and rosemary, and a single white rose called Madame Hardy that smelled of lemons. The rose was still there, though the lavender had grown leggy, and the rosemary had died in the hard frost of 1907, and Thomas could see it from the window as he filled the kettle and set it on the range. He did not look at it often, because looking at it made his chest tighten in a way that was physical and inescapable, but he could not help glancing at it now, and he saw that a single bud was beginning to swell on the oldest cane, a tiny point of greenish white that would open, if the weather held, in a week or 10 days. Eleanor had loved that rose beyond all reason. She had talked to it, he remembered, in a low, murmuring voice that she usually reserved for sick animals and small children, and she had insisted that it bloomed more generously in years, when she sang to it while she pruned. Thomas had never sung to a plant in his life, but he had pruned the rose every February since she died, following the instructions she had written in pencil on the inside cover of her gardening notebook, and the rose had survived, and that was something. The kettle began to sing, and he made a pot of tea in the brown earthenware pot that had belonged to his mother, measuring the leaves with the same precise care he used when he mixed fertilizer for the orchids. He ate 2 slices of bread with a scrape of butter, standing at the kitchen table, because sitting down in the empty chair opposite his own felt wrong, and then he washed the plate and the cup and set them in the rack to dry. By the time he left the cottage, the sun was just touching the ridge of the glasshouse roof, turning the panes from gray to gold, and the air outside was cool and still, with a faint smell of damp earth and the distant, sweet smoke of a bonfire somewhere on the estate. The emotional wound that Thomas carried was not a secret, not to himself and not to anyone who had known him before Eleanor's death, but it was a thing he had learned to carry in a particular way, like a parcel that was too heavy to put down, but too precious to abandon. Eleanor had died on a Tuesday in March of 1906, of a fever that had come on suddenly and burned through her in 3 days, and Thomas had been in the palm house repotting a cycad when the housemaid came running to tell him that the doctor had been sent for. By the time he reached the cottage, out of breath and with soil still under his fingernails, she was already unconscious, and she did not wake again. There had been no final words, no quiet hand squeeze, no moment of recognition. There had been only the sound of her breathing, growing shallower and shallower, until it stopped, and the clock on the mantelpiece ticking on, as if nothing had happened at all. In the weeks that followed, He had discovered that the world did not stop, that the glasshouse still needed stoking, and the ferns still needed misting, and the invoices still needed signing, and he had thrown himself into that work with a ferocity that surprised even Mr. Finch, who was not a man easily surprised. He had worked 14 hours a day, then 15, then 16, and when he finally went to bed, he lay awake for hours staring at the ceiling, his mind running over lists of tasks and temperatures and the names of plants that needed propagating, because if he let his mind stop for even a moment, it would drift back to that Tuesday and the sound of the clock ticking, and he could not bear it. The sleeplessness had become a habit, and the habit had become a way of life, and now, 3 years later, he could not remember the last time he had slept for more than 3 hours without waking. The profession of a glasshouse keeper in a great Edwardian estate was a thing of precision and patience, a craft that occupied a narrow space between gardener and engineer, and Thomas had been learning it for so long that its rhythms were stitched into his bones. He had begun as a garden boy at the age of 14, fetching water and sweeping paths at a smaller estate near Tetbury, and he had been promoted by degrees, under gardener, journeyman, senior journeyman, until he arrived at Marloe Hall at the age of 40, with a letter of recommendation that described him as sober, diligent, and possessed of an uncommon feeling for plants under glass. The feeling was real, though he could not have explained it in words. It was a sense he had that a plant in a pot was not a passive thing, but a conversation, a slow exchange of needs and responses that required the keeper to listen with his fingertips and his nose as much as with his eyes. He could tell by the weight of a watering can whether a palm needed a drink or was still heavy with last week's ration. He could smell the first hint of botrytis on a grapevine before the gray mold was visible to anyone else. He knew the exact angle at which to tilt a pot of seedlings so that they grew straight and strong, and he knew that the best time to take a cutting was not in the morning, as the book said, but in the hour after lunch, when the sap was running slow and the plant was drowsy with the afternoon's warmth. His daily round began at 6 o'clock in the boiler house, a low brick building attached to the west end of the conservatory that contained 2 vast coal-fired boilers, each one a mass of riveted iron and brass fittings that glowed with a dull, constant heat. The boilers fed hot water through a network of pipes that ran beneath the floors and up the walls of every glasshouse chamber, and the temperature in each chamber was regulated by a system of valves and dampers that Thomas adjusted with the care of a man tuning a musical instrument. He checked the pressure gauge first, tapping the glass with his fingernail to make sure the needle was not stuck, and then he opened the firebox door of the first boiler and peered inside at the bed of coals, which glowed orange and white and pulsed with a deep, breathing rhythm that was the closest thing to a heartbeat the glasshouse had. He added 2 shovels of coal, spreading them evenly with a long iron rake, and then he closed the door and wiped his hands on a piece of sacking that hung from a nail. The firebox door clanged shut with a sound that echoed off the brick walls, and for a moment, the boiler house was silent except for the hiss of steam and the creak of expanding metal. From the boiler house, he moved into the propagation room, a narrow chamber lined with slatted wooden benches on which stood rows of clay pots and seed trays, each one labeled in his own handwriting with the name of the plant and the date of sowing. He checked the soil moisture by pressing his thumb into the surface of each tray, and he turned the pots a 1/4 of an inch to correct the slight lean that all seedlings develop towards the light. There were trays of lobelia and calceolaria for the summer bedding, pots of maidenhair ferns that were still too small for the fernery, and a dozen terracotta pots of a new hybrid streptocarpus that had been sent down from the Royal Botanic Gardens at Kew as a trial. The streptocarpus leaves were long and strap-shaped, covered in a fine down that caught the light, and Thomas bent close to examine them for signs of the whitefly that had troubled the previous batch. He found none, and he allowed himself a small, private satisfaction that was as close to happiness as his mornings usually came. The rest of the round took him through the palm house, the fernery, the orchid house, and the vinery, a sequence of spaces that varied in temperature from the tropical heat of the palm house, where the air was so humid that his shirt clung to his back within minutes, to the cool, dry freshness of the fernery, where the temperature never rose above 55 degrees, even in high summer. In each room, he checked the thermometers, opened or closed the brass ventilators according to the weather, and inspected the plants for pests and diseases with a thoroughness that bordered on the obsessive. He carried a small magnifying glass in his waistcoat pocket, a brass-handled lens that had been a gift from Eleanor on their 10th wedding anniversary, and he used it to examine the undersides of leaves and the joints where stems met branches, looking for the tiny, translucent eggs of red spider mite or the white, cottony clusters of mealybug. He found a small colony of scale insects on a cycad in the palm house, and he spent 20 minutes removing them one by one with a cotton swab dipped in methylated spirit, working with the patience of a watchmaker, his breathing slow and even. This was the rhythm of his life, and it had been so for so long that he had almost forgotten there was any other way to live. The work was exacting and repetitive, but it was not dull, because no 2 days in a glasshouse were ever quite the same. A plant that had been healthy yesterday might show a yellowing leaf today. A boiler that had run smoothly for weeks might suddenly develop a knock. The weather outside pressed in from beyond the glass, a constant variable that had to be anticipated and compensated for, and Thomas found a quiet satisfaction in the act of maintaining the delicate balance between the world inside the glass and the world outside it. He sometimes thought, not so much a gardener as a custodian of a small, perfect climate, a man whose job was to hold back the chaos of frost and wind and drought so that the tender things inside could flourish. It was a good job, a necessary job, and it had saved him, in the dark months after Eleanor's death, from the sort of aimless grief that swallowed people whole. But it had also become a cage, though he did not yet know it, a cage made of routine and responsibility and the fear of what might happen if he ever stopped moving. The departure from the cottage that evening was not a departure in the ordinary sense. He was not leaving the estate, not boarding a train or a boat, but it had the quality of a journey nonetheless, because the walk from the kitchen garden to the conservatory at dusk was a movement from one world into another, a passage through a landscape that grew quieter and stranger with every step. Thomas closed the cottage door behind him at 7:15, just as the sun was beginning to sink behind the ridge of beech trees that lined the western boundary of the park. The air was cool now, and it carried the smell of freshly turned earth from the kitchen garden, where the under-gardeners had been double-digging the asparagus bed, and beneath that, the fainter, sweeter smell of wallflowers blooming against the south-facing wall of the bothy. He stood for a moment on the doorstep, his lantern already lit and his logbook in his pocket, and he looked up at the sky, which was a pale, watery blue, streaked with clouds the color of apricots and old roses. It was the kind of evening, he thought, that Eleanor would have called a promise, though he had never been sure what the promise was. He set off along the path that led past the yew walk, a long avenue of ancient yew trees that had been planted in the time of Queen Anne, their trunks so thick and twisted that they looked like the legs of enormous, sleeping creatures. The path was made of crushed stone, and it crunched under his boots with a sound that was both familiar and comforting, a sound that meant the working day was over and the night was about to begin. The yews were dense and dark, their foliage so thick that even in daylight the path beneath them was always in shadow, and at dusk the darkness was almost complete. Thomas walked slowly, the lantern swinging gently at his side, and the beam of light threw shifting patterns onto the trunks and the low branches, illuminating small details that were invisible by day, a spider's web strung between two twigs and beaded with dew, a patch of moss that glowed emerald green in the lamplight, a single feather from a wood pigeon caught on a thorn. The yew walk was 200 yards long, and he knew every yard of it, but tonight it felt longer, as if the darkness had stretched it out like a piece of elastic. He did not mind. He was in no hurry. At the end of the yew walk the path opened out onto a broad lawn that sloped gently down towards the conservatory, and here the light changed again, because the glasshouse was glowing faintly from within, a vast, low shape of amber and gold that seemed to float on the dark grass like a ship at anchor. The boilers were burning steadily, and the warmth that radiated from the glass had drawn a faint mist from the grass, so that the whole structure was surrounded by a soft, luminous haze. Thomas stopped at the edge of the lawn and looked at it, and for a moment he felt something that was not quite pride and not quite wonder, but a mixture of the two, a quiet amazement that such a thing could exist in the middle of the Gloucestershire countryside, a piece of the tropics tucked into a fold of the Cotswold Hills. He had seen it 1,000 times, but it still caught him off guard sometimes. The sheer improbability of it, the audacity of growing palms and orchids and tree ferns in a place where the winter frosts could split stone. He crossed the lawn, the grass damp under his boots, and unlocked the small door set into the west wall of the boiler house. The key was old and heavy, made of iron, with a bow shaped like a clover leaf, and it turned in the lock with a sound that was more felt than heard, a deep, satisfying clunk that traveled up through his hand and into his wrist. Inside, the boiler house was warm and dark, and smelled of coal dust and hot metal and the faint, sweet scent of the paraffin he used to prime the wicks. He lit a second lantern that hung from a hook beside the door, and then he stood for a moment, listening to the familiar sounds of the glasshouse settling into night, the murmur of water in the pipes, the occasional hiss of steam from a valve, the creak of glass panes cooling and contracting. These were the sounds of his other home, the one that asked nothing of him but attention, and he let them wash over him like a tide. He checked the boiler gauges, added a small amount of coal to the firebox of the second boiler, which had been burning lower than the first, and then he opened the inner door that led into the conservatory proper. The change was immediate and total. The air that met him was warm and humid and alive, thick with the breath of 1,000 plants, and it wrapped around him like a blanket. He closed the door behind him and stood in the narrow service corridor that ran along the back of the palm house, a space that was not meant for visitors and was therefore lined with nothing but pipes and valves and stacks of empty clay pots. He hung the spare lantern on a bracket and took up his own again, and then he began his night round, moving through the glasshouse with the slow, deliberate pace of a watchman, his footsteps quiet on the brick floor, his shadow stretching and shrinking as he passed from one pool of lamplight to the next. The palm house at Marloe Hall had been built in 1861 by a young architect who had studied the great conservatories at Kew and Chatsworth, and had come back determined to build something that would rival them, if not in size, then in grace. It was 120 feet long and 40 feet wide, with a roof that rose in a single sweeping curve, from a low brick base to a ridge of iron tracery, 60 feet above the floor. The glass was set in slender astragal bars that had been painted a soft gray-green, a color that seemed to disappear among the leaves, so that the palm house gave the impression of being not a building at all, but a clearing in a forest, where the sky had somehow been tamed and brought down to earth. The floor was not tiled, as in the octagon, but paved with large slabs of York stone that had been worn smooth by 40 years of footsteps, and between the slabs grew a low carpet of moss and tiny ferns that had seeded themselves from the main collection and now formed a miniature landscape of their own. Thomas entered the palm house through the arch at the northern end, and he paused just inside the doorway to let his eyes adjust. The lantern was not bright enough to illuminate the whole space, and the far end of the house was lost in a darkness that was soft and deep and faintly green, the color of a forest twilight. Around him the palms rose in layers, the low, spreading fronds of a dwarf fan palm near his feet, the slender, bamboo-like trunks of a cluster of areca palms that swayed slightly in the draft from the door, and above them, the great, arching leaves of a banana plant that had grown so tall it was pressing against the roof glass. The banana plant was a variety called Musa Ncite, and it had been brought to Marloe Hall as a seedling in a Edwardian case by a previous owner's son who had traveled to Abyssinia and come back with a collection of plants and a scar on his cheek that he would never explain. The banana had flourished in the palm house, producing leaves that were 8 feet long and 2 feet wide, their surfaces ribbed and pleated like green silk that had been folded and unfolded 100 times. Thomas had a particular fondness for it because it was the most exuberant thing in the glasshouse, a plant that grew with a kind of joyful, tropical abandon that made the careful order of the rest of the collection seem almost timid by comparison. He walked slowly down the central path, his lantern held out to one side so that the beam swept across the plants in a slow, golden wave. He checked the soil moisture of the cycads by pressing his fingers into the pots, and he found one that was drier than it should have been, so he made a mental note to water it in the morning. He examined the undersides of the palm fronds for scale insects, holding the lantern close and tilting his head to catch the low angle of light that made the tiny, waxy shields glint like mica. He found nothing, and he was glad, because a scale infestation in a palm house was a slow, stubborn battle that could take weeks to win. He stopped beside a potted tree fern that was almost as tall as he was, its trunk a fibrous column of old frond bases that felt like rough velvet under his hand, and he noticed that one of the new fronds was unfurling in a way that was not quite right, its tip catching against the edge of the pot. He reached up and gently guided it free, tucking the frond back into the space where it belonged, and the plant seemed to sigh, though that was only his imagination. The air in the palm house was full of sounds that became apparent only when he stood still. There was the steady drip of condensation from the roof glass, a sound that had a musical quality to it, each drop striking a different leaf with a different note, so that the whole house was filled with a soft, random percussion. There was the faint rustle of the banana leaves as they moved in the convection currents of warm air, rising from the hot water pipes. And there was, beneath everything, the low, almost subaudible hum of the boilers, a sound that was less a noise than a presence, a vibration that traveled up through the stone floor and into the soles of his boots. He stood in the middle of the path, his eyes half closed, and he let the sounds and the smells and the warmth settle around him like water. For a long moment, he did not think about Eleanor, or the cottage, or the sleepless nights, or the logbook in his pocket. He thought only about the palm house and its slow, green, patient life, and it was enough. He moved on, past a large pot of bird-of-paradise plants whose orange and blue flowers glowed like stained glass in the lantern light, and past a stone trough full of papyrus that had been growing in the same container for 30 years and had formed a dense thicket of triangular stems that rustled when he brushed against them. At the far end of the palm house, there was a small door that led into the fernery, and as he approached it, he noticed something he had not expected. A faint light, not from his own lantern, but from somewhere beyond the door. A soft, steady glow that was the color of candle flame and that moved slightly, as if someone were carrying it. He stopped. No one else was supposed to be in the glasshouse at this hour. The undergardeners had all gone home, and Mr. Finch was away in London visiting his sister. He stood still, listening, and he heard a sound that was not a drip or a rustle or a hum, but a voice, very faint, humming a tune he did not recognize. It was a woman's voice, low and slightly husky, and it seemed to be coming from the fernery. He opened the door and stepped through. The fernery was the oldest part of the conservatory, built in the 1840s, before the Palm House was even a sketch on an architect's paper, and it had a different character from the rest of the Glasshouse. It was lower and narrower, with a roof that sloped down to within a few feet of the ground at the outer edges, and its walls were not of brick and glass, but of stone and glass, the stone being the same Cotswold limestone as the hall, quarried from a pit on the estate that had been worked since the reign of Elizabeth. The floor was not paved, but covered in a deep layer of leaf mold and shredded bark, a soft, springy surface that muffled footsteps and gave the whole space the quiet, secretive atmosphere of a woodland floor. The ferns themselves were arranged not in pots on staging, but in a carefully constructed landscape of rocks and logs and miniature ravines, a facsimile of a Devonshire glen that had been designed by a landscape gardener from Exeter who had spent 6 months living in a cottage on the estate while he built it. There were ferns of every size and shape, from the tiny, moss-like selaginellas that formed a green carpet over the rocks, to the great tree ferns that stood in the corners, with their fronds spread like the spokes of a parasol. The air was cool and damp, and it smelled of wet stone and humus and the clean, green scent of living things that had never known a dry day. Thomas stepped into the fernery and closed the door behind him, and the quality of the silence changed at once. The drip of condensation was still there, but it was softer here, the drops falling not onto hard leaves, but onto the spongy floor, where they were absorbed without a sound. The light he had seen was coming from a lantern that stood on a flat rock near the center of the fernery, a hurricane lamp with a tall glass chimney and a wick that had been turned up higher than his own, casting a warm, steady circle of light that illuminated a figure sitting on a low wooden stool. The figure was small and bent, wrapped in a dark shawl, and as Thomas drew closer, he saw that it was an old woman, her hair white and pulled back into a knot at the nape of her neck, her hands busy with something in her lap. She was the source of the humming, a tune that meandered like a stream through a meadow, never quite repeating itself, and she did not look up when he approached, though she must have heard his footsteps, however muffled. "It's late for visiting," Thomas said, his voice sounding louder than he intended in the quiet of the fernery. He did not mean it as a reproach, but the words came out that way, and he wished he had phrased them differently. The old woman looked up then, and her face was a map of fine lines, the skin soft and papery, and the color of old ivory. Her eyes were pale blue, almost gray, and they had the steady, unblinking quality of a bird's eyes. She smiled, a small, private smile that seemed to be directed more at the ferns than at him. "It's late for working, too," she said, "but here you are." Her voice was exactly as he had heard it from the Palm House, low and husky, with the faint trace of an accent he could not place, something that might have been West Country, or might have been further west still, Cornwall perhaps, or even Ireland. "I'm the Glasshouse keeper," Thomas said. "I do the night rounds. I didn't know anyone else was here." He stepped closer, and the lantern light fell on the things in her lap. She was holding a small bunch of leaves and stems, some fresh and green, some dried and brown, and she was sorting them into small paper envelopes that she drew from a canvas bag at her feet. Her fingers were thin and slightly crooked, but they moved with a quick, sure precision that suggested years of practice. There was a faint herbal smell rising from the leaves, a mixture of scents that Thomas recognized in a general way. Lavender, certainly, and something sharper that might have been rosemary, and a third note that was earthy and unfamiliar. "You're the herbalist," he said, the knowledge arriving in his mind a moment before the words reached his lips. He had heard of her, though he had never met her. She was a woman from the village, a widow, who had been given permission by the old lord, the present lord's father, to gather medicinal plants from the estate and to use a corner of the glasshouse for drying and storing them. She came and went at odd hours, and she was known to the staff only as Mrs. Pargeter, a name that was spoken with a mixture of respect and slight unease, because she had a reputation for knowing things that were not written in books. "I am," she said, "and you are Thomas Hargreaves, the man who keeps the glasshouse warm. I've seen your light moving through the palm house at night, a little yellow star in all that darkness. It's a comfort, that light. I look for it." Thomas did not know what to say to that. No one had ever told him that his lantern was a comfort. He stood awkwardly, the logbook heavy in his waistcoat pocket, and watched as she folded a sprig of dried lavender into an envelope and sealed it with a dab of gum arabic that she took from a small pot. "I didn't mean to disturb you," he said at last. "You didn't disturb me," she said, and she patted the flat rock beside her. "Sit down if you like. The ferns don't mind company, and neither do I. I'm making up the monthly orders for the apothecary in Cirencester. It's quiet work, but it goes faster with a second pair of hands, or just with someone to talk to, if your hands are busy with other things." Thomas hesitated. He had a round to finish, temperatures to check, vents to adjust. But the night was long, and the fernery was peaceful, and something in the old woman's voice made the idea of hurrying seem unnecessary, even foolish. He set his lantern down beside hers, and he sat on the edge of the rock, his hands resting on his knees. The stone was cool through the cloth of his trousers, and the air was so still that the flame of his lantern did not flicker at all. "What are you collecting tonight?" he asked, because it was a question that belonged to his world, a question about plants and their uses, and it felt safer than asking the things he really wanted to know. Mrs. Pargeter picked up a leaf that was long and narrow and a soft gray-green color, and she held it out to him. "This is horehound," she said, "good for coughs and for hearts that are heavy. And this," she held up a dried flower head the color of rust, "is wild carrot. Queen Anne's lace, some call it. It settles the stomach and quiets the mind. And this," she lifted a small bundle of roots that were twisted and brown and smelled of earth, "is valerian. Do you know it?" "I know it grows by the stream," Thomas said. "We dig it out of the borders when it spreads too far." "Dig it carefully," she said, "and give it to me. It's the best friend a sleepless man can have." The words hung in the air, quiet and precise, and Thomas felt something shift inside him, a small, unexpected unlocking. He had not told her about his sleeplessness. He had not told her anything at all. Mrs. Pargeter finished her sorting in a companionable silence that lasted perhaps 10 minutes, though it was hard to judge time in the fernery, where the light never changed, and the only clock was the slow, steady drip of water from the rocks. When the last envelope was sealed and tucked into the canvas bag, she stood up with the careful, deliberate movements of someone whose joints had long ago learned to complain about the damp, and she picked up her lantern. "I have more work to do in the still room," she said. "The little room at the end of the east wing. You know it?" Thomas nodded. The east wing was a narrow corridor that ran from the fernery to the orchid house, and at its far end there was a small chamber that had once been used for storing tools and was now given over to Mrs. Pargeter's drying racks and jars. He had walked past it 100 times, but had never been inside. "I know it," he said. "Walk with me, then," she said, and she set off along the path that wound between the ferns, her lantern swinging in a small, steady arc. Thomas followed, carrying his own lantern, and the two lights moved through the fernery like a pair of fireflies, their beams crisscrossing and separating and coming together again. The path was narrow and uneven, and he had to duck under the low fronds of a tree fern that had grown further over the path than it was supposed to. But Mrs. Pargeter moved through the space as if she had been walking it for 100 years, which she very nearly had. The still room was a small, square chamber with a single window that looked out onto the dark mass of the yew walk, though at this hour the window showed nothing but black glass and the faint reflection of the two lanterns. The walls were lined with wooden shelves, and on the shelves stood rows of glass jars, each one labeled in a neat, old-fashioned script that Thomas guessed was Mrs. Pargeter's own. The jars contained dried herbs, roots, flowers, and barks, their colors ranging from the pale green of dried mint to the deep amber of calendula petals, to the rich, dark brown of oak bark. From the ceiling hung bundles of herbs tied with string, rosemary and sage and thyme, their leaves crackling softly as they dried, and in one corner stood a small table with a mortar and pestle made of dark green serpentine stone. The air was thick with 100 mingled scents, so complex and layered that Thomas could not pick out any single one, only the general impression of something ancient and medicinal, and strangely comforting. Mrs. Pargeter set her lantern on the table and began unpacking her canvas bag, placing the envelopes in a wooden rack that had slots for each day of the month. "The apothecary collects them on the 1st of the month," she said. "Mr. Bristow, his name is. A good man, though he talks too much about his digestion. He makes them into tinctures and pills and teas. People come from as far as Swindon for his digestive tea, which is mostly just fennel and peppermint, but he tells them it's a secret recipe and they believe him." She chuckled, a dry, rustling sound. "People want to believe in secrets. It makes the tea taste better." Thomas stood in the doorway, not quite sure whether he was invited in. The room was small, and with the two of them in it, there was barely space to turn around. Mrs. Pargeter glanced at him and gestured with a twist of her wrist. Come in, you're letting the warmth out." He stepped inside and closed the door behind him, and the sense of the still room closed around him like a gentle fog. He felt suddenly very tired, not in a bad way, but in a way that made the edges of things soften and blur. He had been awake since 4:45, and the day had been long, and the warmth of the still room was a different kind of warmth from the Palm House, drier and more enclosed, like a cupboard that had been sitting in the sun. "You look like a man who needs to sit down," Mrs. Pargeter said, and she pulled a low stool from under the table and pushed it towards him. He sat, and the stool creaked under his weight, and he realized that his legs were aching in a way he had not noticed until that moment. Mrs. Pargeter took a jar from one of the shelves, a jar of dried chamomile flowers, and she opened it and held it under his nose. The scent was sweet and appley, and so familiar that it made his throat tighten, because Eleanor had drunk chamomile tea every night before bed, and the smell of it brought her back so sharply that for a moment he could almost see her standing in the kitchen with the teapot in her hand. "You've lost someone," Mrs. Pargeter said. It was not a question. Thomas looked at the jar of chamomile, and then he looked at the old woman's face, and he saw that her pale eyes were not unkind. "My wife," he said. 3 years ago." Mrs. Pargeter nodded slowly. "I know what that is," she said. "I lost my husband in 1873, the winter of the great gales. He was a fisherman, down in Mevagissey, and his boat went out one morning and didn't come back. They found pieces of it 3 days later, scattered along the coast like driftwood. There was a blue-painted plank from the bow, I remember. It washed up on the beach just below our cottage. I kept it for a long time." She replaced the chamomile jar on the shelf and dusted her hands together. 40 years ago, that was. 40 years, and I still think of him every day. Not with pain now, not usually, but I think of him. "Does it get easier?" Thomas asked. The question came out before he could stop it, and he was embarrassed by its rawness, by the way his voice cracked on the last word. Mrs. Pargeter considered the question, her head tilted slightly to one side. "Easier isn't the word I'd use," she said. "It gets different. The weight doesn't go away, but you grow stronger, the way a tree grows around a stone that's lodged in its roots. The stone is still there, But the tree keeps living, and eventually, the stone becomes part of the tree, and you can't imagine the tree without it. She sat down on the other stool, the one by the table, and folded her hands in her lap. You've been carrying that stone for 3 years, and you're tired. I can see it in the way you hold your shoulders. You're a strong man, Mr. Hargreaves, but even strong men need to put the stone down sometimes. The still room settled into a deeper quiet as Mrs. Pargeter spoke, the kind of quiet that seems to listen. Thomas sat on the low stool with his hands resting on his thighs, the leather logbook pressing against his ribs, and he felt something in him begin to unclench, a muscle he had not known he was holding tight. He had not spoken about Eleanor to anyone in 3 years, not really. There had been the vicar's visit, full of careful platitudes, and there had been Mr. Finch's gruff offer of a week's leave, which he had refused, and there had been the undertaker's professional murmurings about headstones and inscriptions. But no one had simply sat with him in a small, fragrant room and talked about stones and trees, and he found that he did not know what to do with the kindness, except to sit still and let it wash over him. Mrs. Pargeter seemed to understand his silence. She did not press him to speak, did not fill the air with chatter. She reached for the mortar and pestle and began to grind something, a small handful of dried roots that crackled and crunched under the serpentine stone. The sound was rhythmic, a soft grinding that blended with the distant hum of the boilers, and after a while she began to talk again, her voice low and unhurried, as if she were telling a story to the roots themselves. When I first came to Marloe Hall, she said, I was not much older than you are now, though that seems a long time ago. I came here because I had nothing left in Cornwall, nothing but the blue plank and a cottage that was too empty. My sister worked in the laundry here, and she wrote to me and said there was a place for a woman who knew herbs, that the old lord had a fancy for natural remedies and wanted someone to stock his still room. So I came. I arrived on a day in September, with 1 suitcase and a basket of cuttings from my own garden, and I walked up the drive and saw the Glasshouse for the first time, and I thought, well, if I have to be far from the sea, at least I can be near something that grows. She paused to tip the ground roots into a small muslin bag, which she tied with a piece of twine. The old lord was a good man, she continued. He had a curious mind. He wanted to know the name of every plant and what it could do. He would come down to the still room in his wheelchair in the last years and sit there for an hour while I worked, asking questions. He was the one who taught me that a plant is not just a medicine, but a whole life, with its own history and its own preferences and its own way of being in the world. He said that a gardener who doesn't understand the roots of a plant will never understand its leaves, and he said that the same was true of people. She looked at Thomas then, her pale eyes steady. You're a gardener, she said. You know about roots. You know that the most important part of a plant is the part you can't see. The roots are where the plant stores its energy, where it survives the winter, where it holds on when everything above ground is cut back. You know that a plant with strong roots can lose every leaf and still come back in the spring. Thomas nodded. He did know that. He had seen it 100 times, the way a seemingly dead stump would suddenly send up a green shoot, the way a cutting would sit for weeks in a pot of sand, apparently lifeless, and then one day push out a single, tiny root. He had always thought of it as a kind of magic, though it was only biology. You have been living above ground for 3 years, Mrs. Pargeter said. All leaves and no roots. You've been working and moving and doing, and that's kept you alive, and I honor it. But roots need darkness. They need stillness. They need time when nothing seems to be happening, because that's when the real work is being done, underground, in the quiet. She tied another muslin bag and set it aside. You can't grow roots in the light. You have to be willing to sit in the dark. The words settled over Thomas like a blanket. He thought about the palm house at night, the way the plants seemed to breathe more deeply, the way the shadows pooled in the corners. He thought about the sleepless hours in his cottage, the way his mind would race from one task to the next, never settling, never resting. He had been afraid of the dark, he realized. Not the literal dark of an unlit room, but the dark of stillness, the dark of letting go, the dark of allowing himself to feel the full weight of his grief, without the distraction of work to hold it at bay. He had been afraid that if he stopped moving, he would drown. "I don't know how to sit in the dark," he said, and his voice was very quiet. Mrs. Pargeter smiled, the same small, private smile she had worn in the fernery. "No one does, at first. It's a skill, like pruning or grafting. You learn it by doing it, a little at a time, and you learn it best in the company of someone who has done it before." She stood up and took a small brown bottle from one of the shelves, a bottle with a cork stopper and a label that read, "Valerian Tincture, for sleep." She pressed it into his hand. "This is for later, if you want it. But first," she gestured towards the door, "let me show you something in the orchid house. There's a plant there that only blooms at night, and I think it might be opening tonight." The orchid house was the warmest and most humid of all the glasshouse chambers, a long, low room that faced south and trapped the day's heat behind its thick glass walls. It was built of brick and teak and glass, with a floor of red quarry tiles that were always slightly damp underfoot, and its air was so thick with moisture that the lantern flames seemed to burn a little softer, their light diffused into halos of gold. The orchids were arranged on tiered staging that ran the length of the room, hundreds of them, their pots nestled in beds of damp sphagnum moss that released a clean, peaty smell into the air. There were moth orchids with their long, arching sprays of white and pink, and slipper orchids whose pouched flowers looked like tiny, exotic shoes, and cattleyas with blooms as big as a man's hand, their petals a deep, velvety purple that seemed to drink the light. But the plant that Mrs. Pargeter led him to was not one of the showy specimens on the main staging. It was tucked away in a corner, on a small shelf that was partly hidden by a curtain of Spanish moss, and it was not in flower at all, or not yet. The plant was an epiphyllum, a night-blooming cactus with long, flat stems that looked like leather straps and a single bud that hung from the edge of its pot on a slender, curving stem. The bud was the size of a hen's egg and the color of pale ivory, its petals tightly furled but beginning to loosen at the tip, showing a hint of white within. Mrs. Pargeter set her lantern down on the shelf beside it and adjusted the wick so that the light fell gently on the bud. "It's called Queen of the Night," she said. "It blooms once a year, sometimes twice if the summer has been very hot, and it only opens after dark. The flower lasts until dawn, and then it wilts. By breakfast time, it's nothing but a limp rag, but while it's open," she paused, searching for the words, "it's like nothing else in the world. The scent alone could fill a cathedral." Thomas bent closer to look at the bud. He had seen the plant before, of course, had watered it and turned it and checked it for pests, but he had never been in the orchid house at the right hour to see it bloom. The night-blooming plants were a mystery to him, their schedule at odds with his own, and he had always thought of them as slightly alien, as if they belonged to a different kind of time. "How can you tell it's tonight?" he asked. "You can't, not for certain," Mrs. Pargeter said. "But look at the tip of the bud, see how it's beginning to separate just a little, and feel the stem. It's warmer than the air, as if the plant is putting all its heat into the flower. I've been watching it for 3 days, and I think tonight is the night, but we'll have to wait and see." She pulled a small wooden bench from under the shelf, a bench that had clearly been placed there for exactly this purpose, and she sat down on one end of it, leaving room for Thomas. He sat beside her, and the two of them faced the epiphyllum like an audience waiting for a play to begin. The orchid house was silent except for the faint gurgle of water in the pipes and the occasional, almost imperceptible rustle of a leaf, adjusting its position in the humidity. The air was so warm and heavy that Thomas felt his eyelids beginning to droop, and he had to make a conscious effort to keep them open. "Tell me about the sea," he said, after a while. He was not sure why he asked. Perhaps it was the memory of her story about the blue plank, or perhaps it was the sense that the orchid house, with its thick, breathing warmth, was a good place for stories. Mrs. Pargeter was quiet for a moment, and then she began to speak, her voice taking on a different quality, slower and more rhythmic, like the tide. "The sea at Mevagissey is not a gentle sea," she said. "It's a working sea, gray and green and full of purpose. The boats go out before dawn, and you can hear them from the cottage, the chug of the engines and the creak of the ropes, and the men calling to each other in voices that carry across the water. The gulls follow them out, and at sunset they follow them back, and the whole harbor is a noise of birds and men and the slap of water against the stone quay. I used to stand on the quay and watch for his boat, the Mary Ann she was called, after his mother. I could pick her out from a mile away by the shape of her bow and the way she sat in the water. She was a good boat, a lucky boat, until the night she wasn't." She paused, and Thomas waited, not pressing. The bud on the epiphyllum twitched, or seemed to, though it might have been a trick of the lantern light. "The night of the gale," she went on, "I didn't go to the quay. The wind was too strong, and the rain was coming sideways, and the harbor master had told everyone to stay indoors. So I sat in the cottage, and I listened to the wind, and I knew, I think, even before the knock came on the door. I knew it, the way you know a storm is coming, by the weight of the air and the color of the sky. And when the knock came, it was not a surprise. It was just the thing that had been coming for a long time, arriving." She looked at the orchid bud, which was unfurling now in tiny, incremental movements, the outer petals peeling back one by one. "The sea took him," she said, "but it also gave him to me in the first place. We met on the quay, did I tell you? I was 16, and he was 20, and he was mending a net on the deck of his father's boat, and he looked up and smiled at me, and that was it. The sea brought us together, and the sea took him away, and I can't hate the sea for it. The sea was just being the sea." Thomas thought about the glasshouse, about the palms and the ferns and the orchids, about the boilers and the pipes and the thousands of panes of glass. He thought about Eleanor, who had come into his life on a summer afternoon at a flower show in Stroud, who had smiled at him across a display of prize-winning dahlias, and who had been taken away by a fever that came from nowhere. He could not hate the fever. The fever was just being a fever. And the glasshouse, like the sea, was just being what it was, a place of growth and decay, of blooming and wilting, of life that persisted in spite of everything. The epiphyllum opened slowly, the way a cat stretches after a long sleep, each petal separating from the next, with a deliberation that seemed almost conscious. And the flower was white, a white so pure and luminous that it seemed to glow from within, and its petals were long and narrow and slightly ruffled at the edges, like the sleeves of a christening gown. The scent came a few minutes after the petals began to open, a wave of sweetness that rolled through the still air of the orchid house and filled every corner of it, a scent that was part vanilla and part jasmine and part something else that had no name, something cool and clean and faintly spicy, like the memory of a garden in a country Thomas had never visited. He breathed it in, and the tightness in his chest loosened another notch. Mrs. Pargeter watched the flower with a look of quiet satisfaction, the look of someone who had seen this miracle many times before, but had never grown tired of it. "There," she said softly, "now you know why I stay up late." They sat together in the scented darkness, and the flower continued its slow unfurling, and Mrs. Pargeter continued her story, her voice low and steady, as if the flower itself were drawing the words out of her. "After he died," she said, "I thought I would never sleep again. Every night I lay in bed and listened to the wind, and every night I thought I heard his boat coming back, the engine chugging, the ropes creaking, but it was never his boat. It was just the wind, or the sea, or my own heart beating in my ears. I went months without a proper night's rest. I grew thin and strange, and my sister sent me letter after letter, and finally I came here, because I thought that if I could not sleep by the sea, perhaps I could learn to sleep among the plants." She reached out and touched one of the long, strap-like stems of the epiphyllum, her fingers gentle. "The first thing I noticed about the glasshouse was that it never really slept. At night, when the hall was dark and the village was dark, and even the birds were silent, the glasshouse was still awake. The boilers were still burning, the water was still moving through the pipes, the plants were still breathing. It was a different kind of wakefulness from the sea, softer, steadier, less demanding. The sea was always shouting. The glasshouse whispered, and I found that I could whisper back." She turned to look at Thomas, her face half in shadow, half in the glow of the lantern. "That's what I learned in those first years, that grief is a kind of wakefulness, and you can't fight it with more wakefulness. You have to find something that whispers instead of shouts, something that tells you, in its own quiet way, that it's all right to rest." Thomas thought about the glasshouse, about the way it had held him for 3 years, about the way he had used its rhythms, not as a comfort, but as a distraction. He had been treating it as a task, a set of duties to be performed, a machine to be maintained. But it was not a machine. It was a living thing, a community of plants and soil and water and light, and it had been whispering to him all along, and he had not been listening. He had been too busy shouting back. The epiphyllum opened fully then, its petals spreading wide to reveal a central cluster of pale yellow stamens that trembled slightly in the convection currents of the warm air. The scent intensified, and Thomas closed his eyes and let it wash over him. He felt, for the first time in a very long while, that he was exactly where he was supposed to be. The logbook in his pocket, the lantern at his feet, the boiler gauges waiting to be checked, all of it could wait. The flower was here, now, and it would be gone by morning, and he was here, now, and that was enough. Mrs. Pargeter stood up slowly, her joints protesting with a series of small clicks. "I'm going to leave you with the flower," she said. "It's a private thing, a night bloom. It doesn't need a crowd, and I think you could use some time alone with it." She picked up her lantern and her canvas bag, and she paused at the door of the orchid house. "The valerian tincture is in your pocket, if you want it, but I think you might not need it tonight. I think the flower might be enough." She slipped out through the door, and her light receded down the corridor, and then Thomas was alone with the epiphyllum and its scent and the slow, steady breathing of the glasshouse all around him. After Mrs. Pargeter left, Thomas remained on the wooden bench for a long time, watching the white flower glow in the darkness like a small, calm star. The scent of it was so strong now that he could taste it on his tongue, a faint sweetness that reminded him of the honey Eleanor used to spread on her toast, the honey from the vicarage bees that she had always insisted was better than any honey from a shop. He thought about her toast, about the way she would cut it into soldiers and dip them in her tea, a habit she had never grown out of, even though she was 47 years old and the mother of no children, a woman who should have been too dignified for soldiers. She had never been too dignified for anything. She had been the kind of person who would kneel in the mud to look at a beetle, who would sing to roses, who would laugh at her own jokes before she reached the punchline. She had been, Thomas thought, the most alive person he had ever known, and the world without her had seemed, for 3 years, like a photograph with all the color drained out of it. But the color was not gone. It was here, in the orchid house, in the white petals of the epiphyllum, and the green stems of the cactus, and the warm, red glow of the lantern. It was in the drip of the condensation, and the hum of the boilers, and the smell of the sphagnum moss. It was in the memory of Mrs. Pargeter's voice, and in the story of the blue plank, and in the knowledge that somewhere in the glasshouse, an old woman was walking slowly back to the still room, carrying a lantern and a canvas bag, and 40 years of loss that had become, over time, something she could hold without being crushed by it. Thomas stood up. His legs were stiff from sitting, and his back ached in the familiar way that meant he had been working too long without a break. But there was a lightness in his chest that he had not felt since before Eleanor's illness, a small, tentative lightness, like the first green shoot pushing up through bare earth. He picked up his lantern and walked slowly through the orchid house, past the moth orchids and the slipper orchids, and the cattleyas with their velvet purple petals, and he opened the door that led into the service corridor, and then into the central octagon, where the great tree fern stood in its pot, its fiddlehead still furled tight, waiting for the morning. He did not go to the boiler house. He did not check the valves or the dampers or the ventilation hatches. He walked instead to the far end of the octagon, where a small alcove had been built into the wall to house the main water tank, a large, square cistern of riveted copper that supplied the misting system for the ferns and the orchids. Beside the tank there was a wooden bench, a simple thing made of oak planks, and on the bench there was a cushion that one of the housemaids had left there months ago, a cushion covered in faded chintz with a pattern of roses and forget-me-nots. Thomas sat down on the bench, and he set the lantern on the floor beside him, and he leaned his head back against the cool plaster of the wall. The water tank made a low, continuous sound, a sort of liquid hum that was deeper than the hum of the boilers, and it vibrated through the wall and into his spine. He could hear the water moving inside the tank, a soft sloshing that rose and fell in a rhythm that was almost like breathing. He closed his eyes, and the sound filled his head, pushing out the lists of tasks and the worries about temperatures and the endless, circular thoughts about Tuesday and the clock and the sound of Eleanor's breathing growing shallower and shallower. The sound was not demanding. It was not asking him to do anything. It was just there, a steady, patient presence, like the sea that Mrs. Pargeter had described, but softer, a sea that had been tamed and warmed and brought indoors. He thought about roots. He thought about the dark, quiet place beneath the soil where the real work was done, the place where a plant stored its strength and waited for the right moment to grow. He had been living in the light for 3 years, in the glare of work and duty and the fear of standing still. But the light was not the only place to live. There was the dark too, and it was not empty. It was full of roots, full of slow, hidden growth, full of the promise that spring would come, eventually, if you were patient enough to wait for it. He let his shoulders drop. He let his jaw unclench. He let his hands fall open in his lap, the fingers uncurling one by one. The valerian tincture was still in his pocket, the small brown bottle cool against his thigh, but he did not reach for it. He did not need it. The glasshouse was doing its own work, its warmth and its sound and its smell wrapping around him like a blanket, and he felt, for the first time in 3 years, that he could stop. That he could stop, and the world would not end, and the glasshouse would not collapse, and Eleanor would still be gone, but he would still be here. And that was not a betrayal. It was just the way things were. Sleep came. It did not ask permission. It did not announce itself with a fanfare or a warning or a polite knock on the door of his consciousness. It came the way a tide comes, rising inch by inch over the sand, so gradual that you do not notice it until the water is already around your ankles, and then your knees, and then your waist, and by the time you think to move, it is too late, and you are floating. Thomas felt it first as a heaviness in his eyelids, a weight that was not unpleasant, but simply present, like the weight of a cat settling onto a lap. He had been fighting this heaviness for 3 years, pushing it away with cups of strong tea and extra rounds of the Glasshouse, and the sheer stubborn force of his will, but tonight he did not fight it. He let it come. The sounds of the Glasshouse began to blur and blend together. The drip of the condensation and the hum of the water tank, and the distant crackle of coal in the boiler firebox, merging into a single, continuous note that was less a sound than a texture, a soft gray fabric that wrapped itself around his thoughts and muffled them. The scent of the epiphyllum was still in his nose, or perhaps it was only the memory of the scent, but it was there, sweet and cool, and it mingled with the smell of damp moss and warm soil and the faint, metallic tang of the copper tank. The bench was hard under him, but the cushion was soft, and the wall was cool against the back of his head, and his body was slowly, gently, giving up its hold on the day. He thought of Eleanor, but the thought was not sharp now. It was a soft thought, a memory of her sitting in the armchair by the fire, with a book open on her lap, her reading glasses pushed up onto her forehead, the firelight catching the gray threads in her brown hair. She was not speaking, not moving, just sitting there with the book and the fire and the quiet, and the image was so clear and so peaceful that it did not hurt him to look at it. He had been afraid for 3 years that if he let himself remember her calmly, he would forget the sharpness of his love for her, that the grief was the only proof he had that the love had been real. But the grief was not the love. The grief was the stone, and the love was the tree, and the tree was still growing, even now, even in the dark. His breathing slowed. He was dimly aware of it, the way the air moved in and out of his lungs, with a rhythm that matched the sloshing of the water in the copper tank, a slow, deep rhythm that came from somewhere below the level of conscious thought. His hands were still open in his lap, the fingers curled loosely, and the tension that had lived in his shoulders for 3 years was draining away, seeping out of him like water out of a cracked pot. He felt the muscles of his back unknot, one by one, the small, hard knots that had become so familiar he had stopped noticing them. He felt his jaw loosen, his teeth parting slightly, his tongue resting soft and heavy in the floor of his mouth. He felt the furrow between his eyebrows smooth out, a furrow that had been there so long it had become a permanent feature of his face, and he felt, for the first time in longer than he could remember, that his face was at rest. The Glasshouse settled around him, its creaks and sighs and drips forming a lullaby that was not composed of notes, but of presences, of the quiet, ongoing life of the plants and the water and the warm, moving air. The tree fern in the octagon unfurled another millimeter of its fiddlehead, a movement too small to be seen, but real nonetheless. The banana plant in the palm house shifted its enormous leaves in the convection currents, a slow, underwater sway. The epiphyllum in the orchid house poured its scent into the darkness, a scent that would fade by dawn, but that was, for this one night, as real and as present as any living thing. And Thomas Hargreaves, glasshouse keeper, widower, keeper of boilers and logs, and a grief that had not thawed in 3 years, slept. The night passed over the Glasshouse like a slow, dark wing. Outside, in the park and the gardens and the village beyond, the world went about its nocturnal business. An owl quartered the meadow behind the kitchen garden, its call a low, tremulous hoot that carried through the still air. A fox trotted along the yew walk, its brush low, its nose twitching at the scent of voles in the long grass. The moon, which was a waning crescent, rose late and climbed slowly above the beech trees, casting a thin, silver light that was too faint to penetrate the glass of the conservatory, but that silvered the edges of the roof and turned the whole structure into a dark, glimmering shape against the darker hillside. Inside, the glasshouse kept its own time. The boilers burned steadily, their fireboxes glowing dull red behind their iron doors, the coal settling with soft, sighing shifts as the lower layers turned to ash. The hot water moved through the pipes in its endless circuit, from the boiler house to the palm house, to the fernery, to the orchid house, and back again, a closed loop of warmth that had been flowing without interruption for more than 40 years. The thermometers on the walls registered a slow, imperceptible drop in temperature as the night deepened. A drop of perhaps 2 degrees, not enough to trouble the plants, but enough to cause the brass ventilators to contract with tiny, pinging sounds. The condensation on the roof glass gathered into droplets that slid down the panes in slow, meandering paths, leaving trails of clarity in their wake. On the bench by the water tank, Thomas slept. He did not dream, or if he dreamed, the dreams were too gentle to leave any trace, moving through his sleeping mind like fish through deep water, visible only as ripples on the surface. His body, which had been held in a state of alert tension for so many months, had finally, fully, surrendered to rest. His breathing was deep and even, his chest rising and falling with the steadiness of a bellows. His head had lolled slightly to one side, coming to rest against the cushion's edge, and his hands had slipped from his lap to the bench on either side of him, the fingers still slightly curled. The lantern at his feet burned on, its flame steady and tall, the oil reservoir still half full. In the still room at the end of the east wing, Mrs. Pargeter finished her work. She had filled a dozen more envelopes with dried herbs, and she had labeled them in her neat, old-fashioned script, and she had placed them in the rack for the apothecary. She had cleaned the mortar and pestle with a dry cloth and put them back on their shelf. She had checked the jars on the shelves, making sure their stoppers were tight, and she had blown out her lantern and stood for a moment in the darkness, listening. She could hear the silence of the glasshouse, a silence that was not empty, but full of the small, quiet sounds of a living place at rest. And she could hear, very faintly, the sound of breathing, slow and deep and steady, coming from somewhere near the central octagon. She smiled in the darkness, a small, satisfied smile, and she picked up her canvas bag and made her way out through the fernery and the palm house and the boiler room, into the cool, moonlit air of the park, and home to her cottage in the village, where a pot of chamomile tea and a feather bed were waiting. The hours passed. The owl finished its hunting and returned to its nest in the church tower. The fox disappeared into its earth beneath the roots of an old oak. The moon crossed the sky and began its slow descent towards the western hills. And in the glasshouse, the palms and the ferns and the orchids continued their quiet, nocturnal work, exchanging oxygen for carbon dioxide, growing a fraction of a millimeter, repairing the tiny damages of the day, doing all the invisible things that plants do in the dark. The first light of dawn came as a softening of the darkness, a gradual transition from black to gray to a pale, pearlescent silver that seeped through the eastern panes of the glasshouse like water through a sieve. The light touched the roof of the palm house first, illuminating the underside of the banana leaves and turning them into a canopy of green stained glass. It crept down the trunks of the palms, picking out the rough texture of their bark and the fine, silky threads of the spider's webs that hung between the fronds. It reached the floor of the octagon and fell across the black and white tiles, and it found the tree fern and lit its fiddleheads from behind so that they glowed like small, green flames. Thomas woke. He did not wake with a start, as he had woken every morning for 3 years, his heart pounding and his mind already racing through the list of tasks ahead. He woke the way a swimmer surfaces from a deep dive, slowly, by degrees, aware first of the light, then of the air, then of the solidity of the bench beneath him and the cushion at his back. He opened his eyes, and the world was pale and soft and quiet, and for a long moment he did not remember where he was. Then he saw the tree fern and the tiles and the great arch of the glass roof above him, and he remembered. He sat up slowly, his body feeling unfamiliar, lighter and looser than it had felt in years. The lantern at his feet had burned out, its oil spent, its wick a blackened stub. The logbook was still in his waistcoat pocket, its corners pressing against his ribs. He took it out and opened it, and he looked at the page where he had written the date and the temperature and the note about the vent. The ink was dry, the handwriting precise. He turned to a fresh page, and he wrote the new date, April 15th, 1909, and beneath it he wrote nothing at all. He closed the book and put it back in his pocket. The glasshouse was waking up around him. The first birds were beginning to sing in the park outside, a blackbird, and then a thrush, and then a whole chorus of smaller birds whose names he did not know. The light was growing stronger, shifting from silver to gold, and the glass panes were beginning to throw small, bright reflections onto the walls and the floor. The plants seemed to be stretching towards the light, their leaves lifting almost imperceptibly, their colors deepening as the sun found them. The epiphyllum in the orchid house, he knew, would be wilting now, its white petals drooping, and its scent faded to a faint, sweet memory. But it had bloomed, and he had seen it, and that was something that could not be undone. He stood up, stretching his arms above his head, and he felt the vertebrae in his spine pop in a series of small, satisfying clicks. He walked to the door of the boiler house, his footsteps quiet on the tiles, and he checked the gauges, which were exactly where they should be, and he added a shovel of coal to each firebox, the flames flaring up in greeting. He walked through the palm house and the fernery and the orchid house, and he saw that everything was in order, the plants healthy, the soil moist, the pests absent. The glasshouse had kept itself through the night, as it had kept itself through 1,000 nights before, and it would keep itself through 1,000 more. He stepped outside through the boiler house door into the cool, fresh air of the April morning. The lawn was wet with dew, and the sky was a pale, clear blue, with a few high clouds that were just beginning to catch the gold of the rising sun. The yew walk was dark and still, but at its far end he could see the kitchen garden, and beyond it the chimney of his cottage, and he knew that in a few minutes he would walk back along the path and put the kettle on and make his tea, and that the day would begin, and that there was work to be done. But first he stood for a moment on the threshold, one hand resting on the warm brick of the doorway, and he looked back into the glasshouse, at the ferns and the palms and the orchids, at the light moving through the leaves, at the quiet, patient, rooted life that went on regardless of everything. And he thought, not in words, but in a feeling that spread through his chest like warmth, that the stone was still there, and always would be, but that the tree was stronger now, and that was enough.